Hello, and welcome to this Facebook Live edition of The Question Before Us. I hope that those of you who are joining us have been able to tune in before, but I also welcome those who may not have seen this before. My interest in doing this Facebook Live is that we have conversation about questions that are in our world and that are dividing people specifically, and to have conversations so that we talk about things in ways that unite us and not divide us. I think we're getting into a bad habit of being divided into pro and against and just in different categories. And so my hope is that we can build up some conversation around topics that divide us. So tonight's conversation is about dismantling racism. And I am very honored to have with us Jacqueline Sherrill Richards, who's a native of Long Island and actually is in Long Island right now. So we're doing this sort of simulcast, and I'm really glad about that. And she is a lifelong Episcopalian that is currently a member of our diocesan worshiping community, the Episcopal Church at Cornell University. I have as the lifetime of service that includes being a peer educator with Planned Parenthood, as an intern with the New York State Senate, serving as a volunteer hotline counselor for victims of crime and sexual violence. Jacqueline is currently pursuing a Master of Public Administration at Cornell University, where she is president of the Black Graduate and Professional Student Association. Jacqueline, did I miss anything? That's a very impressive resume.
I think you got it all.
Okay. Is there anything that I missed? I mean, that's really exciting to talk with you. So we have a few advanced questions that we'd like to talk about. And the first question I'm going to ask of you, Jacqueline, which is, why is the work of dismantling racism, why do you think it's a Christian issue? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, when I saw the question, I kind of had the moment of like, duh, it just makes sense. Some people actually need a concrete, solid answer. And the only thing else I can think of is that, the platform that Christianity has. It's such a large one. I think by far it's the world's largest religion with a very large population that follows. And when you have that kind of platform, I think it's very important to lead and show the way. And, you're able to do that because you have access to that many people. And in order to dismantle racism, it's going to take massive amounts of people from all parts of the world. It's not, no one can sit on the sidelines. And so I think it's definitely good work and important work, which makes it a Christian issue.
Yeah, I totally agree. And in fact, it's been said, and it actually, I believe, is a statistical reality, that the most segregated moment in America is Sunday morning at church, where everyone, separates out. And I think in Christianity, we have the added, bonus of we worship, Jesus, who is Middle Eastern. And for how many years has Jesus been portrayed as anything except Middle Eastern? And still, nativity scenes and any sort of paintings, there's this sort of, European Jesus rather than a more historically accurate depiction. And so I think it's, you can't love your neighbor if you're not loving your neighbor. We have, this is a multiracial world that we live in. So for me, it's an essential work of the gospel, and especially because racism is so institutionalized worldwide. I mean, we can certainly here in America, we need to deal with our racism, but you look at cultures all across this world, and it just divides us and has become so institutionalized. So we've been joined by 8 viewers. So welcome those of you who have joined to our tonight's edition of The Question Before Us. We're talking about dismantling racism. I'm very glad to have Cornell graduate student Jacqueline Richards with us to talk with us about it. And so we talked about, our first question was, why is the work of dismantling racism a Christian issue? And so our next question, Jacqueline, I'm also getting signs being held. It says baptismal covenant. I am a bishop. I should know these things. Yes, the baptismal covenant that we vow that we're actually going to seek and serve Christ and all persons in honor to the dignity of all human people. So good call. Always good as a bishop to get the baptismal covenant in. It's really a bonus. So that's true. And we take a vow, and we often dismiss those vows as just something we do and forget that just like a marriage vow or a vow to public service, our vow before God is especially important. So Jacqueline, you have a solid history of working to dismantle racism and support marginalized communities. I have a whole paragraph here. You have been a peer trainer for Planned Parenthood. You have worked for the National Coalition for the Homeless, and you're currently president of the Black Graduate Professional Student Association at Cornell and more. So you're a perfect person to answer this question. How does your faith inform your work and keep you going when things really get difficult?
I would have to say my faith allows me to look at my battles and look at them from a blessing perspective. There's literally nothing in my background, history, upbringing that kind of hints as to where I am today. It doesn't make sense. Statistically, I should be off doing something else. And so I'm doing this, and I'm very happy to be here. So I've kind of just understood from a very young age that, the battles that can be looked upon as, hurdles and challenges are also a blessing, and out comes it, growth and opportunities.
That's really wonderfully said. Thank you. And it is amazing how we just came to Holy Week, and with the Passion of Jesus and the story of the crucifixion, our faith really stands in this place of reconciliation and healing and resurrection. And so in those hard moments, Jesus, the story of Jesus and the love of Jesus is right there in those places of brokenness. It's something that is intrinsic to our faith. I also, the Episcopal Church, when we talk about the church or faith, the Christianity dealing with racism, we have to also come at this from a place of repentance. The church has not been at the forefront often where it should have been of advocating for people's rights and dignity. When you look at the history, especially here in the United States, the church often has benefited from racism and has been slow to repent of racism. Years ago, not that many years ago, you can kind of count, but on the anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, the Diocese of Virginia had a service of repentance in Fredericksburg, Virginia, where we went to an actual slave block that still stands in the downtown area, and the whole service was geared toward the diocese repenting of the benefits slavery had been to the church there. I think we have to begin as a church with repentance. We haven't done well with this issue at all, and it's time for us to really take a new crack at it, I think, and especially in this world with so many people hurting right now. And I don't know, Jacqueline, if you wanted to add anything to that. There's so much to be said. It's hard to even know where to start, I think.
Absolutely. I think it's important I think there's a saying to be quick to listen and slow to talk or say something. It's imperative, I think, to start this conversation that way. And you open up the door to a continuing of conversations and changes when you acknowledge wrongdoing and accept the fact that no, it's not us now today. And I think that's the biggest argument that I hear today. Like, well, it was my great grandfather. It has nothing to do with me. No, but when you acknowledge the fact that you've had centuries of advancement over an oppressed people, I think it says something, to that person who is oppressed, that I am recognizing my privilege, and I am going to give you the floor to speak and step aside and stand beside you instead of standing in front of you. So I think it's very important.
Absolutely. I really resonate with what you're saying, because I think lately I keep thinking how people are so quick to speak and to assert their own views, and how I've started listening for how often people actually ask questions or seek to understand, and especially clarifying questions where people ask to understand something. Most of the time people listen to respond,
right,
and don't ask at all. They're just jumping right into talking. So I think that's very, very important, as you say. I've also heard people question whether it's still a problem, and what you just said sort of alludes to that, that, oh, this is an old issue, we're so beyond this, or so 2018. And, but there are people who actually question whether it's a problem in the U.S. anymore, and here in central New York, if we really need to even be responding to that. What are some of the ways you've found to respond to people's lack of understanding?
I can speak from a perspective of being a student at Cornell University. It's my only experience of upstate New York, so. But recently, we've had two incidents of hate crimes on campus, one in September and one recently in March, where there was a Cornell student who was assaulted, as well as racial slurs and being made towards the individual. And so right now, we're having this persistent slap in the face, I feel, to students of color, because, the school promotes that it's a diverse place, and they accept anyone from any country, and they preach tolerance. But when you get there, you're living a totally different story from the perspective of someone who is Black or brown. And so these incidents have kind of shined a light on the fact that racism is not, a grandfather issue. It's young and well and alive. So it's something that we should constantly be trying to tackle as a community, a community in our churches as well as community in our neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. Especially there was an article just recently in the Post-Standard here in Syracuse about professors who are men of color, and they were stopped by police, and who really, it was a basic warrant check of 4 men in a car, all Black men in a car, and this police officer, when you read all that he subjected them to, it's hard to even. In one way, it's sort of shocking in this day and age. And on the other hand, it's so commonplace. It happens all the time. I remember my roommate, one of my roommates in college, and this is going back a few years, not too many. Let's not get carried away, those of you watching, but it has been a few years. But he was driving through a, quote unquote, white neighborhood, and found himself face first on the pavement being, handcuffed, and because he went through a 4-way stop and wasn't drinking, wasn't just, police pulled him over and, suspicious, and thought, oh, who are you? And it feels sometimes like I'm not sure we've made much advancement at all because these things continue to happen. And there are good police, before anyone posts, because I know this will be coming, there are, police work very hard and are really trying. There's some really good police officers trying to make sure that people understand that their first priority is to protect and serve. And yet, as you say, on the campus of Cornell and in these other places, the man, what was the man's name? Stephen? Do I have the right man? He was talking on his phone in his backyard and was shot 21 times.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, it really is time to deal with racism as an institutional issue. This isn't okay or acceptable or in any way understandable, other than to say we still need healing. We still need redemption.
And this problem is a bit twofold in the Black community as well, because those who are light-skinned are not going through the same situations as their brothers and sisters who are dark-skinned. And so I can say, from a standpoint of being a light-skinned woman, I haven't had certain problems that I've come across that my darker-skinned brothers and sisters have come across. My best friend is a police officer. And so, I have great stories to tell about police officers in general. And so it's contrary when I see a police officer and I'm like, oh, hey. And then for them, they go through a whole phase of anxiety, when they've done completely nothing wrong. And so we have to acknowledge that as well, that there's some sort of privilege there as well. So I think the first time that I actually experienced any sort of racism or just, bigotry in general was when I actually moved to Ithaca. And I was in a clothing store. And for the first time, I felt so uncomfortable because the lady refused to service me. My goodness. I was so upset, and I was venting to a friend of mine who's of color, darker than me, and she wasn't shocked at all, where I was having a complete meltdown. The injustice of it all, and and she's, that's just life for her. And so for me, it's like growing up, I didn't realize how important skin color makes such a difference in certain communities. And so it's also important to note that as well.
I think, and I really appreciate you sharing that, because I think that's true. I have a biracial family, and I was in a store one time with two of my kids, one being brown skinned and one being white. And the kid who's white is messing around and, was doing things he shouldn't have been doing. And they were one aisle over from me in the store, and I heard a clerk say, "Are you going to buy that?" very harshly. And I figured, he's doing it, he's at it again. So I went around expecting him to be looking at my son, and instead he's looking at my brown daughter, who's standing there very placidly, appropriately looking at something. And I said, "Are you talking to my daughter?" And he said, "Oh, she's with you?" Very surprised. And I said, "Yes." And he goes, "Oh, well, then it's okay then." And I found myself trying to decide between reactions of just really landing on this guy, and then trying to figure out for my daughter how to model for her how she should act if I'm not there. And so it's very important that she learn how to navigate when I'm not there to sort of jump in and say, speak up for her. And that
because
was
the way you would respond, you would be applauded. Whereas if she was by herself, she would be seen as the mad Black woman, and security would be called and she'd be asked to leave the store. And probably be banned from the store for, the rest of her life. And so it's such a tricky situation because, you don't want to tolerate it. You don't, especially for your children. And it kind of tells your child that, this is something that you just have to get used to. And then you have to have that conversation, which is so hard to have. I think my mom sat us down when we were little girls, and she said to us, because she's also mixed, she said to us, I'm not going to go through some situations that you girls are going to go through. And so I may not understand, but I'll always be your mom and I'll always support you.
Right.
And so not knowing exactly what that was going to look like, I still knew that I had my mom to go to. But it's a very difficult conversation to have, to say to your child that there's two ways to act to it, and it's based on your race.
Oh, it's very painful as a parent. I'm amazed that people, every once in a while I'll mention the talk, which is almost a misnomer. It's not like you have one talk. You do have a talk that's usually the first one, but it's an ongoing talk. It's not something that sort of stops one day. You just have 30 minutes and you're done. And one thing that I try to remind people is the privilege of not having to have the talk. If you haven't had to talk with your kids, if race isn't something that you're daily having to have conversations about, that's a privilege. And that is a huge example of when we have privilege, is when we're not having to constantly be on guard. When my daughter first moved here to Central New York, she mentioned some kid was giving her a hard time. And my antenna went up about, what was that hard time about? And her first comment was, "Oh, I don't think he's a racist. I think he's just a jerk," and it was great because even without me having to say, to ask me questions, she had the language to be processing. But it's very hard as a parent to recognize that and just not be able to change it. I can't do anything to make it a different reality. But like with you, going back and having a talking. Now, there's some other questions. I think some folks have, while we're talking, some other people have jumped in here. One that was asked before we started was that the March for Our Lives movement has had widespread support, whereas the Black Lives Matter movement, which focuses particularly on the safety of Black youth and adults in the U.S., has not found so wide a basis of support, and in fact, some really negative, suspicious responses. So the question was, where does the church stand on this matter? And this is complicated because I don't think people really understand very well the Black Lives Matter movement. I think people, want to jump to all lives matter or think, what is this thing, or that it's some sort of a privilege, and don't understand just what we were talking about with treatment in stores, but specifically so many gun violence deaths and so many gun violence deaths with law enforcement, that there needs to be a focus on Black lives actually mattering. Within the church, writ large, this is a very key part of our baptismal covenant and our theology that all lives matter. And so in this time, the Episcopal Church has made Black Lives Matter something that we're focusing on, but it's still something that there's so much misconception about. And so I think you have some churches that are very confident in saying Black Lives Matter, and they understand why they're talking about it. And then you have other churches who it's not even on the agenda because they don't really understand it. And I don't know, Jacqueline, if you've had there in Ithaca, I know this has been a real conversation piece in a lot of places there. What is your experience? Has your experience been with that?
So I think I lived in Albany prior to coming to Ithaca, and we had a local Black Lives Matter chapter. Ithaca also has a Black Lives Matter chapter. And so the fact that they are so expansive, I find to be so instrumental and helpful and during these conversations and having this dialogue. They're able to aid students of color or individuals of color with resources to tackle some of these problems in their communities. So I really love the benefit of it. But speaking on as far as like my two best friends we were talking about earlier, one of them is a police officer and one of them is, an All Lives Matter fan. And it's like, how is that working? And so we've had to have the conversation. When violence against Black and brown bodies started to pop up all over the place on Facebook, and not to mention those videos are so damaging psychologically for Black and brown people. But when they started to happen so frequently, now that we have access to technology, I was perplexed. I had so many emotions running through me, and wanting to just kind of check out, having a mental health day, and not having the luxury of doing so because I was so busy with schoolwork and whatnot. But me and my friends had to have a conversation about what actually Black Lives Matter is. And why are we saying it so loudly, and why are we trying to reach the mountaintops about it? Because there is a lot of confusion about it, and I don't and I know why there's confusion about it, because it's the politics of protest, to be honest. And I think a lot of people realize that the March for Our Lives students who have been kind of the forefront of this movement, they have checked their white privilege, and I give them that on that, because they realize the platform they have, and they've even talked about the fact that Black and brown children have been fighting this issue for a very long time before March for Our Lives, and yet no media attention, and often they're met with riot gear and those kinds of things. And so I commend them on being able to shine a light on those types of communities as well, well as pushing their own platform. But at the end of the day, it comes down to the politics of it all. Protests create change. And technically, from what I can remember of US history, no one really wants to have a Black or brown individual leading that change. They want someone that looks like them. So it's difficult.
Well, and right now in the political sphere, everyone's using the terms, tribe has come back. Who's your tribe? This sort of primal fight or flight mode of relationship with people who think and look and have the same experience as you. And so there is this real division, which of course is why we have this broadcast. Those of you who've tuned in, to have conversation, trying to find our way back to more of a middle ground where we can actually engage in productive conversation that drives a narrative of healing and reconciliation and finding our way to relationship, rather than continuing to be divided so sharply. And I think the fact that Black Lives Matter is not understood is so perplexing to me, because it's so clearly necessary. These statistics aren't even kept. We keep statistics on how many aspirin people buy. It's inconceivable we wouldn't have better records of, we keep track of how many bullets a police officer fires, and yet we don't have records of how many people are harmed in these situations. And again, your best friend being a police officer and having very good friends who are police officers, this is not about one versus the other.
Right.
This is about really taking a look at who we are as a society. And the Parkland survivors, I have to say, I've been saying at churches for about the last several weeks, when we get to a point where our fear and our closed-mindedness has it being okay that people are putting out death threats against teenagers who are standing up because they were already shot at, and they watch their friends and classmates and people die all around them. We really, as a society, have to stop and ask ourselves what we're doing. We've gone too far, and to be threatening the students in Parkland is inconceivable to me.
Right.
And I really appreciate it. I don't know if you saw this, one broadcaster said nobody can make an adult madder than a teenager. And as a mother of teenagers, I can say that's pretty true. But I still am I'm appalled that anyone would think that on the teenagers. It's really the adults. We need to have conversations. Now let's see. We have some other questions. One is, what are some of the ways the Diocese of Central New York and the wider church is working to dismantle racism? In the Episcopal Church writ large, Becoming the Beloved Community is an initiative of the National Church. It's a focus this year and a very central piece of what the Episcopal Church is about. And that work of Becoming Beloved Community is about dismantling racism, about working together to address the institutional forms of racism and to become aware of and conscious of the ways we need to check our privilege, as you said earlier about the Parkland survivors. In this diocese, we have the Learning Communities initiatives, which are paying attention to God's call for us and listening with God's help to what's happening in our communities and how we can be more of a vital presence to people's lives. And so that means listening to all people in our communities, not just the ones who look like us. And then the anti-racism trainings that are happening. The next one is going to be up in Boonville on April 21st. You can go to the diocesan website, cnyepiscopal.org, to get more details about that. And then someone I'm really excited about is coming to the diocese. Jacqueline, we were talking earlier about her, but Catherine Meeks, Dr. Meeks, is the executive director of the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing in Atlanta with Bishop Rob Wright, and she is really quite exceptional. She'll be here for the ministry fair on May 12th. She's our keynote speaker. And then Stephanie Spellers is speaking at our convention in November. So this year in the diocese, this is something we really are shining a light on, and then with, of course, this broadcast, trying to be aware of. So do you have other questions that have come up since we're chatting? Meredith's here. You can't see, those of you watching, you can't see Meredith, but she's here. I think... did you have more questions? There have been. Let's see. Oh, Jacqueline Schmidt. We in Central New York sometimes think we get a pass on racism since so many leaders of the abolitionist movement, black and white, were active here. However, have you seen, Jacqueline, how racism is embedded in our history here too, even with those histories?
Absolutely. I feel like everyone needs a history course, but not like the normal textbooks that we get to read. Only when you actually are an adult are you able to actually really do the research. But yes, there were advocates and abolitionists of both colors. However, the only ones to, like going back to what I said about the March for Our Lives, the only ones to really create and push the change. I mean, Black and brown bodies or abolitionists who were trying to make this change most likely would not have been able to do it without their counterparts and their white allies. And so, but it came at a cost. So, you can look back at the woman's right to vote. It just became, it was supposed to be, universal suffrage for all, and tied in that was, Black women, but instead it became about just, well, white women first, let us get the vote, and then we'll vote for you guys to get the vote. And so it's kind of like, okay, well, I just have to keep waiting my turn. And that's not how it's supposed to be.
No.
So I definitely have seen that.
Well, and that is such an important piece, not only of history, but to recognize that in current culture, let us figure this out and then we'll let you in. It's, and that was happening. And certainly, with Parkland, that was happening at first, even with that situation where everyone was interviewing the white students and then the other students from Parkland were not getting the interviews. And so right. I was glad that they were checking their privilege and making note of that, because it really it really is important that all voices be heard and be heard together and equally. I think we're stronger together. But so let's see, Jacqueline, I'd be honored if you'd share it. Okay, that's somebody. They would like to know your experience of growing up Black in the Episcopal Church and then being a young woman of color in our diocese now. Some experiences from growing up in the church and how that was like.
I didn't really have any real experience, being Black in the Episcopalian Church growing up. 95 or not, if not more, were Black. We were in a small little community and 99% of the community was Black. So it was no big deal going to an Episcopalian church. It only became a big deal when I came back to the church here at Cornell. When I started having conversations with other students of color who felt like they didn't belong because they were as they say, the fly on the milk. They stand out, so they're more conscious when they walk into a church. What am I wearing? Am I going to be accepted? And so they just don't go. They'd rather not have to go through that. And so I find myself battling with them, as far as trying to understand where they're coming from, because my experience is so different. I've always felt comfortable wherever I am. I'm just one of those lucky individuals, and I make a place for myself. But most people are not like me, so it's kind of hard. So I had my baptism by you, which was amazing, and a few of my friends didn't even know that there was an Episcopalian church on campus.
Oh, wow.
So it was like, well, where is this church? The first time when they got there, they thought it was beautiful and they liked Pastor Clark and they loved your service. And now they have a better understanding, but it's getting them into the door. That's the hard part, because they just don't feel welcomed. Mm-hmm.
And that is so important to me, that we figure out a better way of making sure people feel welcomed and feel that we're here not to judge, but to invite people into community. I go to churches all over this diocese, and this diocese has such a heart to welcome people. But I think we are at this point where we don't quite know each other's language, and we don't know how to communicate past these barriers of race or just not knowing one another. It takes exposure and time to build friendships, and it's kind of hard when you don't have that automatic. It's so encouraging, though, to me to hear your story of having grown up where that was not a barrier. That was just a welcome, and that you were with people who you had such a sharing with. And, Linda White Halverson. Hi, Linda. One of our regular viewers. I can say this because we've done this 3 times, so I now have regular viewers. But anyway, Linda said, what a lovely young woman. Wonderful book in helping all of us understand our own biases and differences, Waking Up White. Oh, I've seen that book. I haven't read that one, but thank you for mentioning that. That is a really, I've heard a lot of people talk about that one. Have you heard about that book? But it is. I think being informed, doing our work. I think it really is important for. And I will speak as the white woman here, but I think the white people need to do our work. We need to learn. I remember the first time I heard about Jack and Jill clubs, and that's something that was just in the African American community. That's just something that's so known, and I had never heard about that. And so for us to do our work and learn about what has been happening outside of our purview, we don't know what we don't know. And there's a moment when we have to recognize it's time to learn what we don't see. And to be very conscious of when we speak and when we listen, And I think that's why, the Black Panther has been so powerful, is because, the white guy is the sidekick. And it's such a simple thing, and yet it's absolutely huge. It's just tremendously big. And that is a great thing. So, and then Linda says again, learn, and keep on learning to grow. Absolutely, Linda. Lifelong learners unite. And especially around this, we have to learn. People's lives are at stake. And boy, our lives can be so enriched by our neighbors. Now, the next question, where can white congregants in this diocese start, especially those in rural areas with less diversity? And I have to say, I go around these very small parts of the diocese, and I do make jokes about, I get my directions, and it's almost like I'm driving up somebody's driveway because it's just very remote. But even out there, I'll look around and I'll see migrant farm workers, or I'll see people working that can kind of seem invisible to other people. But on all of these farms and various places, there's a lot more diversity than first meets the eye often. But it does take intentionality and breaking patterns. So many people here in Central New York have lived here for 4 or 5 generations in the same, geographical area. And that's just, they have their patterns. You go shop here at this store and you go to that place. And so some of it is breaking out of those warm patterns and investigating new areas. But Jacqueline, what might you say to that question about how to find, how to learn if you seem to be surrounded in an area that's predominantly white?
I mean, it's everywhere, to be honest. It's your local coffee shop, it's your grocery store, it's your Wegmans, which I just never knew about before I came to Ithaca. It's your public library. And so those places, it's your church. Those places are going to be places for you to have these conversations. And I think it's important that while we're having these conversations, we're implementing communication skills. Everyone communicates differently. Some communicate with yelling, and that's their way of communicating. That's all they know. And others are thinkers. They don't express anything. They just sit and observe and take in, and that's how, and then they might scribble something on a piece of paper, and that's how they communicate. So teaching good communication skills is very important when we're having these conversations, and being intentional about topics like this conversation. Making sure that you're making time and the space for a specific topic that allows a dialogue. That's also very important.
I really agree. I've actually encouraged a friend of mine. We were talking about the privilege of not having to talk about race. And I said, I try to make it a point of talking about race once a day in some context so that I'm staying aware. And when I read the news, to really look for the way that news is being portrayed, because there are great studies that are happening all over right now about how news is presented to us. When the shooter is a white guy, he's depressed, and when it's a black or brown shooter, but he's a terrorist. And it's and this way that news is brought to us really can influence the way we start seeing people, and we don't even realize it. Because it's just are picking up this, and so to be very conscious about how we're hearing the news, about what's being said, about what's being portrayed, and to be reality testing ourselves. And I think that's part of our work, is every day to be reality testing what we're seeing and what we're hearing, and what difference, if this were a different situation, what would we say? If this. So go ahead.
I'm just going to say that we have a responsibility to kind of do the research. Don't take everything as far as face value. We have a responsibility to look at what we're sharing on Facebook. Everyone's quick to hit the share button, share, but you're actually not reading the article to see if it's actually factual, and then you're just spreading that continuous story,
That's right.
which has a negative cycle. So just be mindful of that as well.
Oh, I really appreciate it. And looking where your source comes from. What news bubble are you in? The whole thing with Facebook going and checking and seeing what's been clicked on you and getting out of your own bubble so you're hearing different voices. I find myself really looking at international news sources and reading the news in different venues to hear a multiplicity of voices. Well, it's time to wrap up. And Jacqueline, I have to say, I could just talk to you. We could go for a lot longer. But do you have any final thoughts or anything that you'd like to add or that we haven't said or addressed?
No, I just want to thank everybody for coming and you for having me. And I'd be more than willing to continue to have this conversation with anyone else offline.
That would be great. And Jacqueline, I really appreciate this. And, I know we're on air and all that, but I just think the world of you. And so I'm really grateful that you're in my diocese. It's just a thrill, and that you're at Cornell. And I'm so proud of you. You're doing such good work. And you just have to remember to take my calls, later in your life, and because you've got a very bright future, and I'm so happy for you. So thank you for your time and the honor of getting to talk with you. I really thank you. All right, guys, thank you very much. Thank you for tuning in, and I look forward to our next question before us. The date says, please pay attention to diocesan social media for future conversation, which means we have not been able to schedule it. That's what that means, is my calendar is a little bit robust right now, so getting time. But we'll do another one of these. And Jacqueline, I look forward to having you back. So good night, all. Blessings.